Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the. Is this 15th?
It is the
16th ordinary meeting of the Literary and Scientific Society at Queen's University, Belfast. You're all very welcome to our debate tonight, which is This House Believes the Famine Was a Genocide. In the evening, as I always do with any announcements, first announcing that I'm pure ghost, so I'll be less exuberant than you're used to this evening, so that's all wonderful. And otherwise, I'll steady on with the announcement that our team, one of our teams, which was Mr. McGarrell and Mr. Cormac Manning, got through to the semi-final of the Irish Times debate. So, great congratulations to them and commiserations as well to our two other teams who were unfortunately not able to get through to the semi-final. What else is there going on? Actually, not very much. Just the same stuff I'm asking you to keep your eye out on. We got the schools competitions coming up. We have our mystery gala debate that's in a couple of weeks, and our formal will be in a month and a bit. So, keep your eyes and ears peeled for all the announcements regarding all that stuff. Did you put your hand up there for something I forgot?
Yeah, well, it's not something you forgot, it's just an announcement I'd like to make. So at the end of the debate, I noticed certain people have been stealing my stuff. Just for a moment, not permanently, there's been no permanent there, but I'd like to say to refrain from stealing my stuff, as I do sometimes try to do like admin and membership stuff, and if I'm trying to run after a microphone, a megaphone, or my sense of dignity at the end of the debate, it can be quite distracting, so please refrain from doing that, so steal his stuff instead.
Don't steal my stuff. In other terms, I'll remind you once again, we have our crossover debate, which is again a weird thing, with Northern Ireland Opera on February the 6th, the Saturday. As I said, I don't know why this ever became a thing, but it is. So, February the 6th, Saturday at 5 p.m. Quietly.
It's the 9th.
The 9th?
Yay.
What day is the 6th?
Wednesday.
Right, well, it's the Saturday of that. On the 9th. I don't prepare these announcements. I'm ad-libbing. I don't know. Alright. Well, anyway, 5 p.m. on Saturday the 9th, or whatever date that Saturday is, does anyone really know? On that Saturday, we'll be having a debate in cohorts with the Northern Ireland Opera's production of Sweeney Todd, having a debate on the justifiability of murder and stuff. Again,
on that point, it's a Sunday.
Is it?
According to the Facebook page, yes.
Well, I have just... oh no.
That requires further attention by me later. I have not confirmed. We'll take an aside from that, as I believe that wraps up any announcements we have, or not.
This Saturday we have a judging workshop with Katie Hurd. She's very, very good. It's going to be in the PFC at 6 o'clock, roughly. Or it's going to be in the Club Room 1, I apologise, at 6 o'clock. This is very good. We've got our schools competition coming up soon. So if you want to help out with that, one of the best ways you can do that is by being a judge. And this is a great overview of teaching you how to judge effectively. And more importantly, if you want to be a better speaker, the best way to do so is to know the judging criteria that speakers often look for, judges look for in competition, and to be able to play around them whenever you are doing that immensely stupid activity known as competitive debates. So that's wonderful. You should all come. Katie Hurd's very, very good. I unfortunately won't be able to make it, but I'll get the IB, but otherwise you should definitely go.
There we go. And that, I believe, will wrap out one. Flip, yeah, you talked about this last week.
The Attorney General will be speaking in Queen's on Saturday, the 9th of February, 1 p.m. at the Old Staff Common Room, and the Minister for European Affairs, Helen McEntee, will be speaking as well. That's at 1 o'clock. They'll be having a panel discussion as well on like Brexit and other things, so if anyone's interested and wants to know more details, send me a message. Thanks.
There we go. There's always stuff going on at Queen's if you choose to engage with it. That'll wrap up the announcements, and I'll now hand over to our Primarch of Past Words Spoken to read the minutes of last week's debate, which was...
Possibly substance you don't.
This House... Oh, terrible. I get worse than you. Last week's meeting, which was This House believes some sins should not be forgiven.
Right, this isn't on. I actually don't know why that isn't on, because I turned it on and it made the noise, so... Is it? Yes, it's on now. Excellent. Seems to have got quieter since this afternoon. Okay. So, I think I'll call last week. I decided to give you the most relaxing set of minutes we've ever had, and I think the response to that was heartwarming, if I'm honest. It was really lovely. So, I was thinking, I could do that again. I could do, I think everyone's up for that. Another relaxing set of minutes. But then I thought about the motion. And I thought, this house believes some sins should not be forgiven. And I thought, why don't I do something unforgivable? And it's something I've threatened to do for a number of weeks. And I use the word threatened in a literal term. So this week is the fateful week. I have decided to theme the minutes around Latin American pop sensation Pitbull. Pitbull as you have never heard it before.
Bang! Let's go! Let's welcome everybody to the song before our music goes in this
Oh, bugger. And it turns into beautiful ambient music for some relaxing minutes. The 15th ordinary meeting of the 170th session of the Queen's University. I feel like I'm wrong doing that, sorry. The 15th ordinary meeting of the 170th session of the Queen's University of Belfast Liquor and Scientific Society took place on the 24th of January 2019 and was attended by 40 members. I knew I would fail you eventually, right? It's happened. President Hugh Dobbin opened the meeting with some announcements before Secretary Matthew Bradley HLM treated the House to what he claimed would be the most relaxing set of minutes ever. Seemingly, if people are going to fall asleep during the minutes, he may as well make it look intentional. Then it was time for private members' business. Mr. Conway Arnold noted the talk of the age at which you can legally change your gender being lowered to 16 in the Republic of Ireland, and that's the House's opinion on the topic. Mr. Robert Clark stated that this made sense, as it brought it in line with the age of consent, and that's the time when you gain full control of your body. Mr. Tom McGuinness brought up H-Bomber Guy's 60-hour live stream of Donkey Kong 64, which raised $340,000 for children's charity mermaids, in order to spite Grey Linehan. Mr. Morgan Hickman informed the House that he found Mr. Bradley's relaxing minutes, and this is heartbreaking, that they were nice last week, and they tweeted out the music and impression of Matt Berry and the refreshing smell of Febreze to be rather pleasant. An expression that I can't speak. Is this a breakdown? Who knows? Let's wish for them to occur more regularly. This statement warmed Mr. Bradley's heart, and he frequently listens back to it as he cries himself to sleep. It's the two of them, let's be class. Ms. Lily Becker Rachel asked the House's thoughts on the recent allegations against Alex Salmon. Mr. Morgan Hickman warned that the issue should not be discussed until the details were clear. In the President's questions, Ms. Chloe Ferguson asked the President to tell the House a secret, and the President revealed that the picture at the back of the Senate room was not in fact the Queen, but her body double, who I can reveal exclusively is Mr. Russell Mayer. The notorious flatmate of the President, Mr. Shea Glasgow, asked Hugh to pick his favourite out of the classic film Scooby-Doo and its sequel, Scooby-Doo 2: Monsters Unleashed. Mr. Dobbin cited the films as a perfect encapsulation of everything wrong with the early 2000s, but exhibited a preference for the second film, admiring its scope. Furthermore, Mr. Luke Braithwaite asked the President his favourite Scooby-Doo character, to which the President responded with Shaggy. Seemingly, Hugh's vote of confidence in the lanky, green-shirted male unlocked Shaggy's full power as the demigod we know he is, a joke which will age really horribly. And clearly has no age at all. It was never born. Mr. Russell Mayer asked Hugh how he is. As Hugh noted, they always ask who's the President, they never ask how's the President. Having sat through a 2-hour-long evidence lecture, Hugh seemingly took solace in his education, claiming, something has to get me those chickies I buy. Mr. Alden McSparrow asked the President who he believes will sit on the Iron Throne in popular television series Game of Thrones. Mr. Dalton claimed that the throne will be destroyed and, balaclava in hand, addressed the portrait of the Queen, threatening, monarchies are bad, you hear me, Lizzie? And I'd love to say I was making that up. Mr. Lane and Rachel M asked if we could do secretary's questions for the following week. Mr. Drummond declined the suggestion, and rightly so. Mr. Hodges asked for a huge review of the latest Dragon Ball movie, which he saw at the Odeon in Victoria Square. The President noted that it was an anime film, so given the demographic, the theatre absolutely stank. And that while there was a huge crowd, it had to be that huge crowd. Finally, Mr. Russell Nairn asked Hugh his favourite sin, and how he would like to commit it. That sin was lust. The target of his sin, Jake Hero. Other President's questions were heard from Mr. Conor McGardle, Mr. Chris Hubble, and Mr. Bobby Clark. The vote of prior opinion was taken on the Knight's motion. This House believes some sin should not be forgiven, which read 18 ayes, 15 nays, and 14 abstentions. I'm not one to believe in curses, ladies and gentlemen. I don't believe it is possible to curse an individual. But considering what happened with the Speaker, how badly my notes have gone so far, and just my general luck this week, I do not believe my luck that it actually hasn't printed properly on this page, and I can't read some of the minutes, so I may have to make them up as I go along. I genuinely can't read some of this. Here we go. Mr. Daniel Lowe opened for the proposition, defining sin as a transgression of a higher law and a rebellion against God. Suggesting that forgiveness is conditional on repentance, Mr. Lowe argued that if all sins are forgiven, if forgiveness becomes a meaningless concept, sins should not be forgiven if there is no attempt at repentance. This is my idea of hell. Regarding the motion as the theological equivalent of "Am I screwed?", Mr. Mark Gilmore spoke first for the opposition, stating, "It doesn't matter if you sinned a tiny bit or if you're Hitler." Mr. Gilmore questioned the proposition's assessment of God as the injured party and elaborated that to say that not all sins can be forgiven is to say that the devil has won and that God will never cast us aside. Speaking second for the proposition, Mr. Lloyd Ferguson noted the distinctly Christocentric view that had been presented so far and examined the forgiveness of sin in other religions. Drawing a comparison with the unforgivable curses in Harry Potter, Ms. Ferguson noted how acceptance and forgiveness are two separate concepts, and that acceptance of sin does not necessarily constitute forgiveness of the action. Second for the opposition, Mr. Shea Glasgow began with confession prayer, as he's about to accuse the proposition of squirreling the motion. Expressing a prior worry of what the proposition may do, Mr. Glasgow stated that, lo, it actually did happen, and claimed that it was undesirable to say that some sins should not be forgiven, as our souls are eternal, and for a sin to not be forgiven would be to confine an individual to eternal damnation. Mr. Shea Glasgow implored the House to vote for the opposition, if you know what's best for you. Closing for the proposition was Mr. Matthew Bryson, who noted that sins are transgressions against God. We have no right to decide to forgive them. Questioning whether we should forgive the crimes of Mr. Morgan Hickman, because of course he did, Mr. Bryson noted that while sins may be easily explained, that does not necessarily excuse them, and stated that the opposition refused to see the irreversibility of the world we live in. Mr. Chris Hubble concluded for the opposition, claiming that we're all sinners, capable of committing sins little and large. And we also found out something about stealing Lindor, which was quite interesting. Mr. Hubble questioned what Christianity provides if not forgiveness, noting the inherently forgiving nature of God. Mr. Hubble concluded by stating that if we do not approach God, we cannot be forgiven. And it is this approach of God that allows all sins to be forgiven. Questions were heard from Ms. Jean Sweeney, Mr. Conor McGardle, Mr. Jonathan William Duranja. 2 fines were issued to Mr. Hugh Dolan, and a singular fine was issued to Mr. Tom McGillis. What naughty, naughty boys. A binding vote on speakerability was taken on the motion, which read 20 ayes, 8 nays, and 6 abstentions, resulting in a conclusive win for the proposition. May I take these notes as read? Nay.
Very, very minor correction, just at the beginning here first. The age of consent in the Republic is 16, it's actually 17.
Is it 17? I was just going off what was said by the speaker.
Okay.
So I may make a note of that. That is the first time the minutes haven't been taken as read, which I'm still very proud of. So these minutes were cursed. I'm off to sit down and everything my life.
I did forget one thing in my announcements, as I always do, which is, could I ask the House please to extend a round of applause to our competitors at the Trinity Women's Open today. We sent down 3 teams and 2 judges, so we just give them a big old competition will have wrapped up by now, so I assume they're presently on their way back to good old Belfast. So, Now we move on to the most increasingly barren time of the meetings as these islands continually revolve around 3 or 4 issues at any given time that everyone's sick of. It's the private member's business, where anyone can bring up anything going on in the world that they wish to talk about. So, if anyone has anything that raise your hand. Go to Mr. Donoghue.
I'd just like to ask the House their opinions on the ongoing situation in Venezuela and the continuing question of whether or not the US should get involved with another country.
I don't have any points to give on that. Mr. McFarren.
No, they shouldn't. To be 100% honest, I mean, they've interfered in South America, Southeast Asia, the Middle East, Africa, quite a lot of places already, so give it a rest already, lads. And the truth of the matter is that this is like if a Labour backbench MP who didn't really like Theresa May and the direction she was going in Brexit, she was in an economic disaster, decided to declare herself as Prime Minister and then try and get up support from the rest of the United Nations. So no, I don't think they should in any way get involved in situations which they already made worse to begin with.
Any other views in the room?
Please,
Mr. Hickman, very eager looking.
I'm going to struggle to stand up here, but forgive me if you let me laugh. There we go. Right. One thing worth noting, and I think it's something that has kind of it's gone unsaid in the first question and unaddressed by the response, is that there are manifest and multiple human rights abuses in Venezuela. There is an absolutely atrocious record of bloodshed in a bloody civil war where individuals are protesting against a violent and oppressive dictatorship. My question would be, in fact, how can a country, a neighbouring country nearly, stand by and allow these human rights abuses to happen without taking some action? I'm not condoning any particular action, but doing something, arguably, is necessary.
Can I respond? I'll go to Mr. Murphy.
I think there are plenty of things that you can do to restore peace in order. The first thing you can do is lift the international sanctions that have been placed on the Venezuelan government by the US and its cronies. I think that's the first step that you take towards actually having some form of actual economy in Venezuela again. The US are perfectly aware that Venezuela as an economy is heavily reliant on oil. That is why OPEC has been lobbying to make sure that oil stays as cheap as possible, absolutely gutting and bottoming out the Venezuelan economy. Now, I recognise that there's plenty of economic mismanagement on the behalf of the Maduro government, and the fact that they haven't attempted to diversify their economy in any way, shape or form really. But I think we need to recognise that they are, to a large extent, as an oil-based country, reliant on international trade in oil. And as far as the US allied with Saudi Arabia, who, just like to point out, are not exactly clean on the human rights front either, are largely responsible for what's going on in Venezuela. I think they should stay out and they should lift the international sanctions and allow Venezuela to try and get back to the democratic country that at its heart it is. It has the best elections, one of the best election systems in the world. It has one that most of the European Union would be very proud to have. It has Maduro has a higher approval rating than most of the people who are criticising him have. And I think they should be allowed to return to the democratic country that they once were, unmolested by the United States.
I've forgotten your last name, sorry.
Christopher Dawson.
Yes, Mr. Dawson, sorry.
Well, while I'm no fan of President Maduro, I think he is trying to institute a form of authoritarian rule in this country. He is violating human rights. And there have been major discrepancies in the electoral process in Venezuela.
Hold on one second.
Go ahead.
I'm sorry, you're going to have to offer some proof for that because there's not a shred of evidence. Well, I'm sorry, something as fundamentally undemocratic as allowing the opposition to run a perfectly normal election campaign, canvassing the entirety of Venezuela, running an elections as normal, putting posters up. The only reason that they didn't run in the last election is because they knew for a fact that they would lose by a landslide, which they did.
I don't accept those points. I think if you look at the international bodies that were invited or sometimes uninvited to look at the most recent elections in Venezuela, they've all said that there was very common intimidation, rigging, that sort of thing. But like I was saying, while I'm no fan of President Maduro, I think the United States is primarily motivated by control of resources in what they see as their sphere of influence. They expect Venezuela to follow the lead of the United States. And any talk, the President's Chief Security Advisor, John Bolton, I think left on a sheet of paper to be read by everyone that he was thinking about sending 5,000 troops to Venezuela. This should be totally out of question. I don't think Venezuela is any worse than multitudes of countries that the United States supports. I think I saw a figure that 73% of dictatorships in the world receive United States support. So any pretense that this is a moral foreign policy position by the United States is utter nonsense.
Well, one last piece on this, Mr. Patton.
When it comes to the actual talk of democracy in Venezuela, I think you might slightly mistake it. Unfortunately, for example, the government tried to create a second house that would be controlled by their cronies because they knew they couldn't get legislation passed by the currently elected one. But unfortunately, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of America, so I'm coming down more on your side. We've seen from the Monroe Doctrine onwards, America sees to make South America an extension of Manifest Destiny, believing that they have a right to control their actions, control their resources, control their people. This could just be another attempt to do that. If it's 5,000 troops, or doing what they've done in countless countries of just replacing the dictatorship with one they like more, we can't allow them to do this, we cannot stand for it.
And any separate pieces of private members' business in the room, go to Mr. Nairn.
Thankfully, a more light-hearted piece of private. But I had an interesting experience yesterday, in fact, and somewhat extended upon today, in that I bought into the sort of marketing hype. I bought into what Twitter and the various sort of hype rage machines telling me to do, and I tried a vegan sausage roll from Greg's. And only to find, I was very, very impressed to find that the vegan sausage roll from Greg's is actually, in my opinion, as good as, if not slightly better than the regular sausage roll. And that is a very hot take, because I'm not a vegan and would never consider becoming one, but it was actually very, very nice. Their synthetic sausage paste is surprisingly convincing. And also not as greasy at all. The only problem with it that I found in my extensive review was that it smelled like nothing, which was just slightly disconcerting. And so the main thing I want to go to the House about regarding is their particular thoughts on vegan synthetic substitutes for foods, if they have any recommendations for things they think are nice in that field, and the entire sort of area surrounding it as a whole.
There's a spot of vegetarians in the room. Any responses to Mr. Nairn's point? Oh, look, it's Morgan.
I'm not standing up again.
It's okay, we can all see you. Settle as we can.
Or lucky, it's up to you. Actually, Marks & Spencer do a very nice kind of vegan vegetarian burger with beetroot colouring in it. It's very, very pleasant. I tried it recently because I was remarkably impressed by the fact that it actually looked like it was the right colour for it, rather than being the colour of a cooked burger. So if anyone wants to try that and corroborate my experience, feel free. I don't make any money from it, but please sponsor me, Marks & Spencer's.
Point of order.
Did you say point of order? Bloody hate those. Right, I can't deny them, unfortunately. So.
That was just a clear propaganda piece from Marks & Spencer, what you just did there.
You could have addressed that as an additional point, that didn't.
I don't think that's the point of order.
That's the problem. I can't tell what is or isn't a point of order until it's already said. If it turns out not to be a point of order in content at all, it's already too late. It's a broken system. We need something to on in here. Anyone else? Have any thoughts on the vegan? It seems like there aren't, so I'll move on to your substantive
Right,
points.
so the Dave's getting tested there to start, so I'm going to give you a bit of a so, last week in Northern Ireland, a 14-year-old rape victim had to travel to the UK for an abortion. Now, I'm wondering what the House thoughts are on this, and does this demonstrate a clear reason as to why we must at least look towards updating our laws on abortion here in this 6th county state?
Go to Mr. Nairn.
I mean, this is ultimately the abortion debate. People who are in favour of abortion are going to say that we need to update the laws. People who are against abortion are going to say that we shouldn't. For my 2 cents, of course, I think we should. I think it's interesting in the South. It's going to become more viable in that option, but I don't think it gives any excuses for why we shouldn't have it as a basic practice here. But I think that we're just going to end up going back and forth on this in the same camp as we always do, whenever it's one of the 3 issues that affect us currently.
On to the High Court right now, if I'm not mistaken. I'll go to Mr. Bunting.
So yeah, I concur with what's just been said by Mr. Nairn. The only difference I would make is sometimes it's very difficult because it takes a case like this to kind of focus our attention on something like this. We should be thinking about it already. The only thing I would kind of correct in what's just been said is no one really is pro-abortion, but they are pro-choice, and we should be affording women the choice over their own bodies. Our abortion laws are draconian, they're inhumane, and they date from before the invention of the light bulb, and it's time to go again.
Here. We'll go to Mr. Nelson.
I think this, well, I agree with the points made, and I think this raises a wider point of the cowardice of the British government to legislate change that is desired by the Northern Ireland public but can't be delivered by storm, even if it was in existence because of the petition of concern. And the British government seems satisfied to let Northern Ireland just be run by civil servants, and I think that's a disgrace.
Mr. Maureen Hickman, back again.
Actually, I'm not going to make any substantive points, but if anyone is particularly interested in this, we did a debate last year called "Would This House Would Repeal the Eighth?" So if anyone is particularly interested in this debate and would like to hear more from both sides, have a look on the podcast.
I was going to plug that as well. You and I were of similar minds. It's pretty raucous with people with signs and everything.
Well, they didn't. To be fair, they had the signs of photos outside. We just misconstrued what they had them for.
I don't like your signs.
Shame signs.
No better signs than here tonight. I'll throw you out. Mr. Patton.
The simple fact of this law, though it is draconian and terrible, is that it turns abortion and women's right to choose into a class issue. The simple fact is that not everyone can afford to go to England to seek the healthcare that they need. It means that only the wealthy and the middle class are able to take control of their own bodies, whereas those in the working class are left to their own devices in the most desperate of circumstances. This law creates a divide between the classes in Northern Ireland. That's no surprise because that's
I think I'll ask Paul for any.
One that I've just got is actually really interesting after checking my emails.
Yeah, sure.
So I just like to inform everyone because this is mildly entertaining. I had a little project where occasionally I look up domains that are defunct to see if I can acquire them. My most recent attempt at an acquisition was a site called genitals.com. This was for the very simple reason that were it for sale for less than £100, I would have my email for the next 2 years be russellnairn@genitals.com. Purely for my own amusement. Unfortunately, I'm after getting an email back from the gentleman I contacted regarding this, and it appears to be $75,000. My GoFundMe will be going up tomorrow. If anyone would like to contribute to giving me genitals.com as an email address, thank you very much.
Wouldn't be the worst crowdfunding campaign I've ever seen.
Does anyone have a hat? You can have a whip on it.
If anyone has any thoughts on that, off, isn't it? Oh, is that?
Well,
Mr. Bradley.
If they go to genitals.com, you try genitals.biz, genitals.co.uk,
Genitals.ie.
genitals.gov, A&M.
I'll try that, thank you very much. Mr. Rogers, and after that I will mercifully wrap
in your search, acquire the history of genitals.com to find what it was before it became defunct. Whose genitals were they?
Well, I was going to have, if I were to acquire it, I was going to have it permanently redirect to qeb.ac.uk. But I'm satisfied.
I hope you've enjoyed the intelligent discussion because it now swiftly comes to an end as the President's questions begin. This is the part of the show where anyone has something they want to ask me for any reason. And again, your questions don't all have to be ones that probe deeply into my personal life. You may ask them now. My God, there's not many this week. Mr. Hickman.
If you could be a razor blade company, which razor blade company would you
I am definitely not the best a man can be, as anyone observing. As I said, I would probably go for Bic. Because that's what I use. As you can see by the horrific neck beard, I'm sporting the singular Bic disposable razor that I've been using for the past 3 weeks. Doesn't really do the job that well, so there we go. Miss Boyd.
It's not so much a question, it's a public service announcement.
I know.
Glad you did county the other day in the interview, just wanted to know.
Of course.
It's career.
Was there any photos? Yes, for any of you who weren't aware, which I assume is almost all of you, unless you really care about what I do in my free time. Myself, Mr. Hubble, and Miss Boyle were having a grand old time in the bar/club Cuckoo on Tuesday night, where we did a karaoke night, grand fun enough, where we did our own rendition of, obviously, because that's just the era we come from, did a rendition of Smash Mouth All Stars karaoke, because of course we did. So there you go, that's your public service announcement. That's what I do in my free time. Mr. Nair.
Mr. President, early, myself and Mr. Bradley were in the English social space, and we were having a discussion. We were inquiring as to various economic factors. One of these ended up revolving around the Chocolate Brothers, and we discovered that in their property, I'm getting on to that. Paul Chuckle, very recently, Tuesday night, in fact, we went to Cuckoo over visiting him. DJ'd at Filthy McNasties. He has a gig in which he's occasionally DJing. Yes. And we discovered that at the height of their performance, the Chocolate Brothers could be hired out for $3,500 for an evening. I imagine that is now halved. And I'm wondering if, using the Litterific's considerable wealth, you could hire Paul Chuckle to guest chair a debate. Would you do it? And which debate would you have him guest chair?
You know, Barry's dead, so I hope you all think good about your chuckling just would I spend 3,000 quid getting?
Well, it would be half of it.
You'd assume.
Was it 3,500 or was it 35,000?
No, it was 3,500 because it was 6,200 to hire some other bloke.
Okay.
And he looked like a rapper or something. And then Paul and Barry Chuckle beneath him very cheap.
If there's anything that proves how much our society is fueled by nostalgia, it's Paul Chuckle doing DJing.
It was very good. We watched a video of it. It was very good.
I'm trying to think now, because now you've got me ranking through the target card that, as you've seen from the announcements, I can barely remember what happened last week. Zooming forward, what do we have that Paul Chuckle could have a decent laugh at? I'm sure he'd love to do a debate on the EU superstate. I'm sure that's just right up his alley. Don't throw it to me, I can remember my own turn card. we could, let's get him in for the, this house regrets internet pornography. Why do we get Paul Truckle in for that? And he'd show up expecting to do the DJ gig, and then he sees everyone here in their check shirts and sweater vests, and he's like, what's this, lads? Yes, that's my answer to that. Any separate question now? Monsignor Hubble.
Building on that, can we make that happen, please? Can you extend an invitation to Paul Truckle? Don't pay him $1,500. Just ask him.
Can we have a motion of this house would extend an open invitation to Paul Truckle to visit the Litterific?
I'd second that.
Aye, because you should all vote for it because you just think you're bloody hilarious. Let's have a go. Yeah, might as well put it. Right, fine. Motion is this house will extend an open invitation to Paul Truckle about that. If you would vote in favour, raise your hands and say aye.
Aye.
I know who's a member, so I can scope this out.
Really good in the hard
What is that? Is that 22? 28. 28. We'll go with yours. You're always right. And if you would vote opposing that, raise your hand and say nay.
Nay.
I never liked the Truckle Brothers. It's slapstick comedy and not a fan. I don't laugh at other people's misery.
I call order, people. This is a serious issue. You can tell because I'm so enthused in the result of this vote we're having. We'll go finally to abstaining votes, and if you don't care at all, raise your hand and go nay. Right.
Is our version of Danny Healy
Matthew Bradley, read back to me the vote on the thing that I will absolutely forget to do.
Okay. This house will extend an open invitation to Paul Truckle. There were 28 ayes, 2 nays, and 1 abstention.
There you have it. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. I hope you all feel proud of yourself. You're changing the word one retired media now. We're finishing up really early, so I'll see if there are any more President's questions. Really like to try and drag this out. Mr. Kieran.
Mr. President, we live in a mad world these days.
We do.
We are living in a world where resignations, reshuffles, and all sorts of nonsense is happening at every level of government. How would you respond to the news that the Batman has resigned? I am not kidding.
How would every eye? That's an interesting question. I'm trying to think of a response though, like get on that or somebody, so give me a minute. If the Batman resigned.
He has.
He has?
Ben Affleck has.
Oh! Ben Affleck, that's right, Flip. I was wondering you were talking, I thought you were talking as in like the fictional Batman has given up his crusade, which obviously given his psychosis he never would because he wants to die, basically. Yes, this is our weekly pop culture President's question where we see how I think about the latest news in media, and I don't care. I'm not going to be Batman anymore. Anyone in the room can fight me if they want. I don't think he was very good at it, and all of the films he played Batman in were terrible. So, good riddance to both Ben Affleck as Batman and so, yes, good riddance to Ben Affleck's Batman and the DC Extended Universe as a whole, because it was omni-shambolic. There we go. Does that satisfy your question, Mr. Kenneth? Fantastic. We're still like very good for time, so I'll ask for many more, but again, I know this is dragging on every week, so I'm more than happy to wrap it up. Looks like it's wrapping up time. So, we're about to move on to the stuff that you actually come to these for. That's a joke. We all love the like pre-bit content, obviously. So, the motion for this week is this House believes that famine was a genocide. We now move, as we always do, to the prior opinion vote. This is what we think in motion before we come in this evening and before we hear the words of all of our speakers. So, and everyone can vote in this. I mentioned about members only earlier. This one is open to all. So, if you would vote in favour of the motion, this House believes the famine was a genocide, please raise your hands and say aye. Okay. And if you would vote against, please raise your hand and say nay. Nay. Okay. And if you would wish to vote abstaining, please raise your hands and go bleh. Right. So, I now hand you back over to our Emperor of Enunciations, Matthew Bradley. Will you read us back that vote, please?
I honestly don't think I'm deserving that title after what happened earlier, but I'll read the vote anyway. There were 24 ayes, 12 nays, and 7 abstentions.
Right, so the ayes have it then, the ayes have it. All of them. These are low energy tonight, or maybe it's because I'm low energy, I'm not too sure. So, we're now ready to move on to the substantive business of the evening. And so I please welcome up our first speaker for the proposition. Please welcome up Mr. Ulkenrick Sparrow.
Live, so it's probably good now, right? Okay. First of all, before I start speaking, I just want to say, Matthew Bradley, you deserve the title which you just gave me there now. You deserve that title. Anyway.
Thank you, Mr. Man.
You're welcome. Anyway, members of the opposition, fellow members of the proposition, Mr. Secretary, Mr. President, members of the House. We of the proposition are of the strong conviction that the Irish famine was a genocide committed upon the Irish people, and this was not a natural famine, but an artificially manufactured hunger across the island of Ireland. Now, before I address the main crux of my argument, I'm going to quote some statistics, which I'm sure many in this room will be more than familiar with. However, I feel need to be said again. So people truly understand the magnitude of suffering and death which occurred during the famine. There was enough food, though, to feed the Irish people. They didn't die because of the potato blight, but due to a lack of care and understanding to their situation from their landlords and the negligence of the British government under the command of Lord John Russell. The result of this lack of care is over 1 million Irish men, women and children died from starvation and famine-related diseases, and over 1 million more were forced to emigrate from their homes to have a chance of survival, and many, we must remember, didn't make it. The opposition made claim to us that this was a tragedy, but it was no genocide. And I could believe this if the crisis had only affected a few thousand people, and there had simply been some mismanagement which had resulted in these deaths. But whenever I read a statistic like 1 million people, then I cannot in good conscience say that that is the case. No. This was a genocide of gross negligence that resulted in deaths which otherwise would not have happened. How can 1 million of your...
Negligence and malevolence are not the same thing.
I will be addressing this issue later in my speech. However, I will be addressing this issue later. Okay? Well, negligence can lead to malevolence whenever the negligence clearly does harm onto someone, and you should know that's what anyone thin bar. How can 1 million of your supposed own people die and you refuse to take responsibility? I ask, if the same situation had arisen in Somerset or Wiltshire, do you believe the British government would have allowed in excess of 1 million people to die? I seriously doubt they would. No. Regarding the famine and its status as a genocide, the opposition will predictably mention in their speeches how through the lens of clever lawyers, the Irish famine cannot be classified as a genocide. They will try and argue that there was no intent to destroy. However, what they are failing to acknowledge is just how difficult it is for a travesty of human rights in it, such as the famine, to be classified, internationally recognised as a genocide. So I think hiding behind some legal jargon to say the famine wasn't a genocide is pandering to similar arguments made by historians who try and claim the Ukrainian famine of 1932 to 33 caused by Stalin wasn't a genocide. Who's it on that point? No. Okay. The situation is virtually identical to the Irish. Yes?
Could you clarify your definition of a genocide, please?
I will be again addressing this issue there in my speech. However, I would classify it as a genocide as whenever there is intent to destroy, either through initially setting out or whenever you have clear suffering occurring before you and you do nothing to otherwise assist in helping people that are your own people. However, going back to the situation in Ukraine, which is virtually identical to the Irish, the Ukrainians had taken from them the grain the Ukrainians grew was taken from them by the Soviet government and they were left to starve. In Ireland, the potato crop was blight-ridden and all other foods had to be given to rich landlords as payments, leaving the Irish to starve to death. Now, I would be amazed if I found anyone in this audience who would defend the actions of Stalin in Ukraine and would argue that this wasn't a genocide. However, what happened with the Irish is a virtually identical situation. Lord John Russell and his cronies, Joseph Travelin and Lord Lansdowne, are as bad as Joseph Stalin. His Soviet cronies, one group just has better PR. So if you morally condemn the Ukrainian famine as the genocide it was, then you too must morally condemn the famine which occurred in Ireland, as they are virtually identical scenarios. We see this time in the West, the phrase now coined laissez-faire economics was developed. The idea that if you just leave something alone, then it will sort itself out. This, however, is complete rubbish. In regards to the famine, some may call the actions of the British government not banning the export of food, which was common practice in famine-struck countries at the time, not bringing in any meaningful supplies, and believing it was best for the economy to sort itself out as laissez-faire. We of the proposition call it couldn't care less. They were well aware of the situation in Ireland, but viewed the Irish as someone who was not worthy of their help. They let them die. This can be seen repeatedly throughout the history of the British Empire. If we look at Bengal, in India, whilst the British governed Bengal, we see an unprecedented 7 famines. Before the British arrived in India, Bengal had not one famine, resulting over these 7 famines in 60 million deaths, casualties rivaling those of the entire Second World War. Morally, we must ask ourselves, morally, what happened in Bengal, and due to the subject of this debate, particularly what happened in Ireland, were these genocides. If you have the ability to save your own people, but you deliberately choose to hold them in contempt and let them die when you can save them, you have committed a genocide against them. You intentionally destroyed them through your lack of action. I want to finish by quoting Michael Davitt, the late 19th century Parnell contemporary. God brought the blight, but the English created the famine. Ladies and gentlemen, I ask you to now vote with the proposition that the famine was a genocide committed upon the Irish people, and I thank you.
Please now welcome up, speaking first for the opposition, Mr. Finbar Rogers.
Ladies, gentlemen, and alliance voters. I can really go for a pish. But on with the argument anyway. The famine was no more genocide, or more was no more genocide than is the contemporary famines in Yemen or Ethiopia today. The reality is that Britain, working from a position of pure pragmatic and short-sighted self-interest, drained Ireland of its resources and created a circumstance where there was a massive working class which was entirely subsistent on one crop. And when that failed, it led to a massive disaster. The quote from Michael Davitt, in fact, works to our positions. They created the Brits effectively created circumstances by which a famine would be disastrous, and then as insurance companies would say, an act of God, made it a disaster. Unless the proposition is prepared to suggest that the Duke of Wellington performed some kind of rain dance for the crops to fail, then they really don't have much of a case. British attitudes towards Ireland have always been, not right now, have always been and continue to be defined by shocking ignorance and a total lack of disinterest. The late historian of UCD, Roland Fannin, in his book Fatal Path, effectively summarised this when he said, the First World War gave Asquith the perfect chance to do what he had always wanted about Ireland. Nothing.
On that point,
Yes?
surely you cannot
Don't want to answer my question. That's fine. You can meet later on. I'm just being polite.
Okay, surely
It's interesting to you as a person.
Surely it is clear that when there is money and power to be gained, the British have an interest. So to say that the
Yes,
British
they
have
do.
no interest in Ireland is a fallacy.
Precisely what I said. They drained all the resources they could from it. And then, oh, dear God, they're all dying. Who saw that coming? That's just what I said. We're not disagreeing. Further evidence of this can be seen today. If you read any newspaper, any day, anyone from Jake Rees-Mogg to Karen Bradley, and their mental inertia, which is just hair-pullingly mesmeric. But this debate, though, it speaks to a wider point about conspiracy theories in general. So now what is assumed is that these things are always the work of shadowy figures in some dark room.
On that point.
Bilderberg or Scientology. But what it actually boils down to is human sheer incompetence and ineptitude. Usually American, in the modern world, because Americans are stupid. But quite often Brits. The Brits are not stupid, they're actually quite clever. But they are also very silly. And shockingly arrogant. Like, clever, so arrogant that you'll just hit them and be against them because they annoy you. The insidious side of this effect it leads us to a way of thinking that we lose sight of genuine and honest-to-God conspiracy theories. There was only a few weeks ago there were people marching through Derry saying J.R. Jackson, speaking to a time when innocent civil rights marchers were shot in the streets of Derry. And it has been accepted by the British government that the British Army were acting totally unlawfully. And yet there have been no legal ramifications. Worse still was the case of effective racial profiling. After a bomb went off in Guildford, the English police forces drove to a heavily Irish area and picked up two people walking down the road and charged a random Irish family of crimes that they not only did not commit but could not possibly have committed, resulting in a 14-year-old boy being held in a maximum security prison.
On that point,
Okay?
what does any of this have to do with famine being
I'm saying it's more important as conspiracies go. Because these people are still living. I'm referring of course to McGuire 7. And then what's tall and close to where we are now is the case of the Car Poison, which was effectively managed as a brothel by the security forces for years for the Troubles.
On that point,
Yeah.
you use the phrase more important. I'm surely think one of the greatest tragedies that this nation has ever encountered, with the millions dead, is more important.
Well, it wasn't actually millions dead, it was a million emigrated, somewhat less than a million died.
on that point?
The greatest tragedy that this nation encountered, more people died as a result of the 1798 rebellion. More people died as a result of the and also more people, actually, I start with more people died as a result of the Commonwealth invasion. More people died as a result of the 1798 rebellion than as a result of the Commonwealth invasion. This nation has suffered a lot of tragedies, so we could be here for a very long time. But basically, the support of this motion is to support that side of republicanism, which appears to be mainstream at the moment, which pushes for a border poll as quickly as possible and as soon as possible, and is perfectly happy to see a simple majority passed. 50 plus 1, not 52-48, but 50 plus 1. Rather than recognising the complexity of the reality of the last two centuries. And instituting a kind of comprehensive plan to rebuild this nation from all of its parts involved. In short, we should all just rise up. Thank you, Mom.
And speaking secondly for the proposition, please welcome up Mr. Cameron Mullen.
Thank you very, very much. Just to address what the first of the opposition said, a couple of things. Ending with, it's not the relevance, the importance of it. We're arguing about the whether it was genocide or not. I just didn't think that was relevant at all. And as I mentioned, the border poll and Republican debate, I've just written here, it's probably, I'm glad I've written, it's probably best to nail this point home now. Consumption was not aware of the religious and political constitutional demand for weeks ago. We are not here to level our Republican or nationalist critique of the British government from time immemorial up until the Guildford bombing, or this week even, citing the famine as a part of the case study. We are here to coldly and rationally analyse the events that occurred from 1845-51, and essentially the case that the British government's actions, or lack thereof, was the reason why there was a famine, and that was a genocide. The world in which we live in today has witnessed countless examples of genocide that have prompted international human rights laws to clarify what the term actually means. We might have given a proper definition there in the first part. The United Nations defined it in the Article 2 of the Convention of Genocide as an act committed with intent to destroy, in whole or in part, a national, ethnic, racial, or religious group. And with relevance to the debate tonight, it includes within its categories the act of deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. The question is then whether the actions of the government were deliberate. For example, i.e., were they capable of preventing such devastation, and by failing to do so, were they aware of the consequences of their omission? Now there may be a debate about whether omission is the same as action, but I'll continue on just saying that extract from speech made by then Colonial Secretary at the time, Earl Grey, in the House of Lords in 1846, demonstrated that there were members of the government who were aware of the impact of decisions on the crisis in Ireland. He says, "My Lords, it is only by its Ireland's government that such evils could have been produced. The mere fact that Ireland is in so deplorable and wretched condition says whole volumes of argument, and is of itself a complete and irrefutable proof of the misgovernment to which it has been subjected." Continuing on from Hawkins' couple of points on British policy in the period, how it was coloured by laissez-faire economics, and the attitude of the Prime Minister at the time. It was Robert Peel in 46 and Lord John Russell until 1851, and their aversion of interfering with market forces could be seen as the government's reasoning for inaction. I believe this was a strong component of the motivation. It could also be said that it was the apathy towards Ireland and the Irish that coloured the view and informed policy decisions that meant very limited attempts would be taken.
On that point?
Yeah, where we go?
Just a question about the idea of the tax levied on landowners for individuals that were in poverty. That led obviously to them being turfed out of their homes. But was that not a policy by Westminster to try and ease the suffering of those that were most impoverished on the island of Ireland?
I would say things like that and the relief, tokenism, kind of makes themselves feel better more than it really helps anyone else. It might have done more John Russell's away, made his conscience feel better than morality, but it doesn't think it really was a fancy candle enough to count. That's what I said.
On your previous point?
Yeah, go on.
So, if you say that the laissez-faire economic policies were certainly an aspect, but discrimination might have been an aspect, I think if you're going to argue that this was a genocide, then you need to give more substantive proof that the leading figures of the British government did hold prejudicial views towards Irish people?
15 seconds, we did that. It could also be said that there was apathy towards Ireland and the Irish that plugged up against foreign policy decisions that meant very limited steps would be taken. Now, I'm agreeing with you technically on this. On apathy or economic policy, it could possibly be argued that there was no deliberate intention to inflict such devastation and death, and therefore this should not be seen as a genocide in the UN Conventions, the narrow definition of it. But no, I completely reject the apathy and laissez-faire play the part. Apathy, not at all. I think that should be not. I do not think for 1 second there was a lack of self-interest in this island that could result in the children of the richest nation on earth lying in ditches with the grass just running green from their mouths. I do not think for 1 second it was something more malign, something more deliberate that would motivate such a preeminent force as the executive of the central government of the British Empire, who sit and watch while families went silent except for the cries of the last starving child. From politician to pauper, a thought so vitally proliferated throughout Britain and infected the minds of the men who were charged with the government of Ireland, and that when the crop failed, famine and pestilence raged and ravaged the land. A thought so heinous it would make you lose faith in God because that's what they believed. These ultra-evangelists, these moralists and providentialists believe that it was God that sent his light to reduce the overpopulated Irish, like Michael Davitt said, and damn them for their sins, providence and pest control. Malthus was a political economist or a minister off the top of my head, big faith in his ideas that overpopulation was a problem, and it was. He didn't address it, and then he thought it would be easier maybe just to let it sort itself out. Population gets too high, it goes again.
On this point,
yeah.
You've talked there about the famine as being an act of God, and of course Trevelyan did say that he believed God had caused the famine, but surely that's just a Christian viewpoint generally, rather than, which nearly everybody was a Christian at the time, rather than believing that people deserved it necessarily.
True, but the idea of providence and manifest destiny are taken today, I'm going to just reference in a second, could not be seen in our modern context as the lunatic genocidal mindset of the administration. In 1846, Robert Peace, Home Secretary, writes just to show that he was surrounded with people that did really believe this and thought it is awful to observe that the Almighty God humbles the pride of such a low nation. If a belief that God was delivering damnation upon their people, and you therefore must not interfere with this cleansing fire, but see it as a good and holy thing, if that is what you believe, is that not the mindset of what you would describe a genocidal administration, something you may see today and be appalled by? And if you can't describe it as that, then what can you? Keep that in mind, providence and pest control. In such a world, what then would be the absolute tales of Ireland? Protectionist measures, as was mentioned, would have done the trick, but when faced with one of the most extensive food shortfall for a century, they decided not to close the traditional port to keep food within Ireland, or to prohibit the distillation of grain. These measures were traditional responses, food shortages, and the failure to implement them beggars for relief. The blight is not solely an Irish phenomenon, and appeared throughout Europe in 1845-46. Famine, however, was a rare occurrence, as the governments of other European nations implemented the practical measures that meant their people would not die. These fatalists put more stock in the atonement and repentance of the Irish than embargoes and relief measures. Limited measures were taken within a year, and when 90% of the crop failed in 1846, they were held back by the then replacement Prime Minister, Lord John Russell. I want to again reiterate what my colleague finished his piece with, the immortal words of Michael Davitt. God brought the blight of English Great Famine. Ladies and gentlemen, I now ask you to vote with the proposition that the famine was a genocide committed against the Irish people.
If I can ask, sorry, for a second round of applause for Mr. Mullen's maiden speech. Now please welcome up speaking secondly to the opposition, Mr. Christopher Dawson.
Thank you very much. This is of course my maiden speech to the House, and I don't think any of you know me particularly well. So you might think I'm mad or eccentric to make my maiden speech on such a controversial topic. I hope that I can convince you that I'm the wiser over the course of this debate. And I hope to convince this House that much perception of the Great Famine has been in the narrative of seeing invidious and perpetual opposition between Great Britain and Ireland as historical facts. And I will argue that in the case of the famine and generally, this view is not entirely correct. The Great Famine was the greatest tragedy to occur in our island, and its effects could have and should have been mitigated. But it is certainly not true to say that the suffering of the Great Famine was intended by the British government. And the admittedly limited response of the British government should be understood in the context of the political and economic institutions of the UK and by the dominant theories of the time, and cannot be considered negligence to the point of genocide. For 3 consecutive years, the potato crop failed because of blight. It was an unprecedented disaster that contemporary states were entirely ill-equipped to respond to.
On that point,
go ahead.
Not one other European nation, because of the potato crop blight, experienced famine. And furthermore, there were measures that could have been put in place to prevent it in Britain, such as whenever the £3.5 million worth of potatoes went out in the food source of the ash, there was, and quite literally, tokenistic £100,000 worth of grain gave in, and that was still at market value, which many people couldn't afford. So there could have been measures implemented quite easily by any sensible government to have stopped the disaster.
Well, there's 2 points there. Firstly, I would say there was no single European country as reliant on Ireland was on the potato. So you can't really say that situations of completely different scales are comparable. Secondly, on the point of imported imports, go ahead.
I would just say Russia wasn't that reliant, but like 90% in 1845 for them and 80% for Ireland.
Yeah.
They may not be reliant, but maybe this is just stereotypical, but I thought they were pretty reliant on that, and they were grounded on.
Well, Ireland itself had only recently become reliant on potato. It had been cereals mainly prior to the 1840s. Russia never experienced any kind of potato like Ireland did. So the argument that this suffering was in any way intended by the British government, we should look at Irish history prior to that. Ireland had been a colony from Great Britain from the time of Henry VIII, subject to Queen's law and the penal codes which discriminated against Catholics. This situation, of course, culminated in the 1798 rebellion, which showed great dissatisfaction with the British domination. In response to this, the British government decided to integrate Ireland with Great Britain. This proposal received widespread support. Many believed that union and Catholic emancipation would go hand in hand, as well as bringing economic benefits.
Widespread support from the Protestant ascendancy, but after a lot of riots,
that was to the Protestant ascendancy and the Catholic Church, as well as the Catholic middle class, were entirely behind this proposal. Okay, so, however, King George III famously blocked Catholic relief, blaming the proposal on his madness. This caused the British government of William Pitt to resign, and King George and his successor blocked emancipation for the next 28 years until 1829, which did display more bad faith to the Catholics of Ireland. The active union and the support of Parliament in government for full rights for Catholics does prove, however, that there was strong goodwill towards Ireland from the British establishment. The Drummond administration of the 1930s made it in Ireland to reduce the power of landlords and orangemen. As for the governments of the 1840s, neither Robert Peel nor John Russell bore ill will toward Ireland. Let me finish my point. Peel has been described by QB Professor Liam Kennedy as having a constructive and active interest in Ireland, and Russell expressed a long-held desire to bring justice to Ireland. Okay?
Liam Kennedy is notoriously anti the famine was genocide. In fact, he debated Tim Coogan on this issue last year, I believe, on the point that you don't need anti-Irishness, you need blind indifference, which is what they have.
I'm getting to the point. At this time, economic liberalism and pro-free trade theories of Adam Smith and David Ricardo were treated as received wisdom, particularly after the Cornwall debates. At this time, only 1 in 5 males could vote after the latest reforms in 1832. Britain was ruled by an oligarchy of class and gender, not ethnicity. Adam Smith is still regarded by many as the greatest economist of all time. Therefore, how can we consider in good faith the failure of laissez-faire classical economics to constitute neglect when many of the brightest minds of the age consider those practices to be the most appropriate actions? Highbrow magazines and papers like The Economist and The Times argued for non-intervention, and The Times said that the laissez-faire policy could be one of the greatest experiments of the age. As I said in my introduction, the famine is too often seen as consistent with a narrative that sees British and Irish people in constant opposition. But we should remember that the United Kingdom was a political and economic oligarchy that represented the upper classes of Great Britain and Ireland, not just England. Workhouses, squalor, pollution and malnutrition affected the working class across Britain and Ireland. The death rate in London for children under 5 was 33% in many London boroughs. The everyday mistreatment of the entire working class has gone unnoticed because of how normalised and normal it was. The working class of Great Britain was equal to the working class of Ireland in rights and poverty. The main thing that divided them in the 1940s was the massive and unprecedented crop failure, not ethnic genocide. The crop failure was exacerbated by a completely unrepresented oligarchy who believed that what was in their interest was in everyone's interest. I therefore ask members to reject this motion.
And I ask again, please, for a second round of applause for Mr. Dawson. And now please welcome on speaking thirdly and lastly for proposition, Mr. Colin Ricardo.
Ladies and gentlemen, I don't stand here as a nationalist or an Irishman. I stand here as a person who looks at history and sees an island that was decimated by famine. An event that occurred that completely changed the face of this island. The simple facts of the Irish famine is that we lost almost half of our population because of this event, be it through death or emigration. Look around this room, 1 in 2 would be gone. Well, actually no, that's wrong. Because people in this room are members of the Literary and Scientific Society of Queen's University Belfast, established in 1850. And I'm sure we all agree that members back then would have been of a high social standing. So I don't think very many of them would have succumbed to the famine. And this leads on to a very clear point. And we make this mistake. We talk about the famine being a tragedy for Ireland. Dublin was very, very minorly affected. Belfast, not so much. The further west you went, the more tragedies occurred. It was not a nation that suffered. It was a unique set of people within that nation. And that brings us on to our first point. And this is the first point defined by the UN as a point of genocide, a specifically targeted population. The specifically targeted population was the native Irish, the Celts, as they were referred to in London. These people have been pushed off their land by Cromwell, as he famously said, to hell or high. The second key point outlined by the United Nations, which helps foster and bolster the argument of a genocide, is a clear history of discrimination against this targeted population. Thank you. And in most genocides, this simply does not come about immediately. There is a clear historical narrative that exists. The penal laws, first passed in 1695, strictly enforced inherited rights of Irish Catholics, of native Irish, to live and thrive in their own society. And William McAfee Thackeray wrote, "It is a frightful document against ourselves," in English, one of the most melancholy stories in the whole world of the brutal slaughter and persecution of the English regime in Ireland. This is all true, yes.
Would you say that the British government had a greater interest in decimating the Irish people than in gaining economic goods from them?
That's a very good question, and in fact it brings me on to my key point here, is that it suited the British government in economic terms to decimate the native Irish. And this is the key issue here. The key facet of genocide is an intent to destroy. It's very difficult to prove. We will do this in the proposition tonight. By arguing this point, I would like to engage in some rebuttal with the first speaker. There was no shortage of food in Ireland, though after his events there might be a shortage of Guinness. But there was no shortage of food in Ireland during the famine. Shocking ignorance and total lack of disinterest existed in England. And he's correct in saying this. But as I raised in my POI, this disinterest did not extend to economic benefit. Britain seeked to reap all they could out of this island. And it was not working well for them anymore.
You've cited my colleague's comments. There was complete disinterest in Ireland, but do you not think it would be more appropriate to target my argument where I set forward evidence that there wasn't disinterest from Great?
No, I agree with you. That's the point that I'm making, is that there wasn't disinterest. There was interest in how they could make as much economic benefit as possible. But this structure wasn't working anymore in Ireland, because what we had was an overpopulation of the land. The population was growing exponentially after the rise of the potato. Then what we had was the strip farming, the inefficient ways in which the Irish agricultural system worked, and that tenants would raise their crops simply to survive. And this was growing peasant population. The British government knew something was coming. They knew that it was unsustainable. So much so that Lord Palmerston, Prime Minister at the time, and I quote, "Look, don't we all agree that the solution to the land problem is to get the surplus population off the land?" How would they go about doing this? And why would they want to free up the land? After the famine, if you look at strictly economic terms, the labour market was freed up, the small inefficient tenant farms were no more, and this unlocked massive economic potential that was harnessed by the British government on the island. And the point about the more important, it was one of the important issues, yes?
Do you not think Lord Palmerston's comments are more related to a desire to industrialise the population of Ireland?
No, I do not. Simply because Lord Palmerston and other members of the higher-ranking members of the British government were informed by rising and leading Irish politicians that something needed to be done. And yes, you said industrialisation, increased infrastructure, perhaps a humane way of emigration was presented to the British government, which they simply ignored. Another quote from Lord Palmerston: "We look forward to the day when the Celt is as rare on the banks of the Shannon as a red man on the banks of the Hudson." Now, it doesn't take much to identify what he means by this statement. He wants the removal of the Irish population of the land. And when the famine came about, it was the most convenient and easiest way for them to implement this policy. Yes, it is difficult to acknowledge the famine was a genocide. There is still an argument that has been presented by the opposition, and very well presented, that this was simply a tragedy that suited the British. But the British fostered this tragedy through their system. If you inflict a wound on a man and you let him bleed to death, it is not his bleeding that kills him, it is your wound you've inflicted. The wound the British inflicted on Ireland was the way in which they fostered, through their laissez-faire economy, a savage, unfair system that left the native population at the bottom and allowed them to suffer and die when the famine struck. They did not close the ports. They exported the grain and the crops that Ireland was producing to feed their growing empires abroad in America and abroad to the east. There was riots at the port as the starving population watched food being shipped across the ocean when they starved and died. N.J.P. Taylor declared all of Ireland was a Belsen in reference to the notorious concentration camp. Not all concentration camps were death camps. Others simply fostered a culture of death, where they created the conditions which allowed those people to perish. During the famine, the island of Ireland was no different from the native Irish. I would urge you to vote with the proposition
that the famine was an act of genocide.
And closing out for the opposition and the debate as a whole. This is disorder of the highest degree. Closing for the opposition and therefore the debate as a whole. Please welcome up Training Officer Mr. Russell. I'll give him time to pop over that cold one with the boys before.
Do you want a cold one, Russell?
No. He wants a warm one. I wish the cold embrace of the grave, right?
So, good evening, everybody. What we have here is a primary point between two sides, is connecting around the definition of genocide. We've both accepted the UN definition of genocide here, and throughout my speech I'm going to explain why the way in which they're interpreting it is inherently untenable and leads to what occurred in Ireland in regards to the famine to be a tragedy but not a genocide. I've got three main points for you today. I'm going to talk about what a genocide is and why this isn't one. I'm going to talk about the dangers of diminishing the meaning of a term like genocide, and finally I'm going to talk about laissez-faire economics and why this is an example of the failure of that. So, we have the requirement for intention for something to be defined as a genocide. You must actively seek to destroy this group. You must seek its destruction. You must wish to see them utterly wiped out. Examples of genocide in Rwanda is a good example of a genocide where one group is actively seeking to kill and remove the other from the map. But what we have here is a situation, no thank you, is where help was not offered, where nothing effective, shall we say, was done to fix this problem because of the belief in the economic system at the time. We cannot place responsibility in this regard for not helping, because in that system, under that definition of what a genocide is put forward by the proposition, we can take things like homelessness to be a genocide. We can take social inequality in general to be genocide. Go ahead, Olga.
You're saying we can take things like homelessness to be a genocide. However, the difference between homelessness and between the Irish situation are very distinct and often. Ireland is a nation where the entire nation was being starved to death. In the case of homelessness, they can be people from any background.
Across the world today, there are nations starving because of the inherent social inequality perpetuated by the West. Are you suggesting the West are perpetuating genocide upon them? No, they are using their capitalist system to create an inherent economic and cruel inequality, but they are not perpetuating genocide in this regard. And we cannot hold the British government responsible for this as a genocide. Justice, no thank you. So, there is no inherent intent to destroy the Irish people here. There is all we see as an incompetence and a focus on laissez-faire economics and the worshipping of the market as God. No thank you. So, why is it important that this is not defined as a genocide? Why can we not define this as a genocide? Because we really like to increase the broadness of terms nowadays. We love it. We think it's great. Communists, we love to throw that one around more broadly. Fascists, we really like to throw that one around. Genocide. The main point of clash here we have is this a genocide or not? We have the emotional argument, it was bad, it was a lot of people dying, so it was a genocide, and we have our factual basis in the fact that it's not. It's a famine. We have a word for what it was, and that was a famine.
On that point?
No, thank you. The famine was a famine, and we should treat it with all the socio-economic baggage that comes with it. Because when we treat this as a genocide, it completely misrepresents it on a sort of international political sphere. No thank you. We cannot accept that this is not an equivalent situation to something like Armenia. This is not an equivalent situation to something like Rwanda. This is not an equivalent situation to something like the Holocaust. It cannot be compared in those terms, and should be compared in the terms of famine and socio-economic equality. No thank you. So, we just can't call it something that it isn't. Because if we do, we look at the socio-economic, like the famine was an issue of economic inequality. It was an issue of class, essentially, like at the end of the day. Goods being shipped away to upper classes out of the hands of those who actually need it. It was laissez-faire economics at its core. It was brutal oppression for economics. But it was the reason that was because they believed that economic system to be right and perfect. It was not because they were intentionally going out of their way to destroy that economic system.
Yeah. It wasn't just economics, like I said. It was maybe the appetite, but definitely an inherent dislike, despise of the Irish that let them do these things. They wouldn't have done these if it was.
Yeah, thank you. I'll take that point and go on and talk about the fact that yes, there were a few people who you can find who actively hated the Irish, but the overarching worship within Western liberalism at this time was laissez-faire economics. It was the worship of market as God. And we can see this through, beyond all ideology. Yes, you'll have your few ideologues who hated the Irish and thought it would be better because of it. But the true essence of the issue was individual landowners, consumed by their own greed, wanting to take these things and ship them off and to make their money from that. That's what the famine was at its core. It was a socio-economic disaster. It was an issue of class. It was not something we can attribute to an action of genocide by one group against the other.
On that point?
No, thank you. It was, and it is something that we really need to pay attention, and we really need to highlight the importance of this, because this is what happens when we treat money as more important in people's lives. This is what happens when we worship the market as this all-divine being that we almost swear loyalty. No, thank you. And because that's very interesting. Carr had a point in his speech where he talked about the fact that, yes, technically after the famine, there were economic conditions were better. But that's exactly what laissez-faire economics wanted. In a way, laissez-faire economics worked. It was not genocide so much as it was laissez-faire economics coming to its natural conclusion, which is, no thank you, people not mattering, and money being all the people are concerned with, or profit, or whatever you want to talk. The market is God, essentially. This, we cannot suggest it was an attempt at murder. If we think that this was a genocide, we are operating off the same kind of morality that suggests that if we're walking down the street and we see a homeless person, and we don't give them some money out of our pocket, and they later go and starve to death, we're suggesting that we murder them. We cannot operate off that morality. That it intrinsically doesn't work. So, to conclude for you all, we can't define the famine as a genocide because there is no intent to commit genocide. There is no active intent to destroy the people. By calling it a genocide, we do disservice to the term on a political sphere and make the term far too wide and ultimately useless. The term that means everything that means nothing. And finally, that the reason that this occurred was not due to an active intent of genocide, it was the natural conclusion of laissez-faire economics, and shows why we should abandon that stupid system inherently. Thank you very much.
Many thanks to Mr. Nairn, and please get one more round of applause for all of our speakers this evening. Alright, we do go now, as we always do, to some rounds of questions. So, firstly, we have questions for the proposition, if there are any in the room. I know he has one. Mr. Perry.
I'll just quickly answer my question. Firstly, why would it be in the British government's direct interest to decimate the Irish people as a race? And the second part is, you talk a lot about laissez-faire economics. Well, and that is the approach that you sit back and let things play out how they see. Surely that contradicts an active genocide. Because an active genocide obviously involves going in and actively killing people. So surely that's a bit of a conflict.
In terms of why they want to their population, as Russell said, in terms of it suited them to clear the land of that population and a brand new system. In terms of the activeness of it, activeness and intent can be clearly different things. If you intend to destroy someone and you see this opportunity and you have, there's an interesting thing in law, it's called the assumption of duty. I know you know duty. If I see you drowning in a lake right now and I save you, I know duty. But if I assume care of you, I must save you or I'll be held liable. As citizens, especially after the Act of Union in the 1800s, as citizens of the United Kingdom, the British government had an assumption of duty to care for those. And that is the action. The action is, ironically, a disaction.
And would anyone from the opposition like to respond to that? Yes.
Well, I think the question, in my opinion, is slightly flawed because we can't assume that the committers of genocide are thinking rationally. But I will say that from the proposition, we've had some misinterpreted quotes. We've had a general feeling that they might have discriminated against the Irish. But this is, as I tried to argue in my speech, this is all singularly built on the narrative that Irish people and British people are opposed, which I don't think is correct.
And moving on to any questions in the room for the opposition. Mr. Topic.
If we assume that it was a famine and not a genocide, why didn't the British Empire get involved in helping the people, since Ireland was supposedly, or the Irish people were subjects of the British Empire? Why didn't they get involved and help them medically or for that provide?
For the very simple and I think you'll agree with me, it's a very stupid reason not to get involved in this. The reason they had was they worshipped laissez-faire economics. They believed the market should have its way and the market should reach its natural conclusion. And if the market was deciding this is how things work, that's how they did it. They couldn't interfere.
No. Can I add on to that?
It's one person answers, one response.
Yeah, essentially Russell's trying to pull the wool over everyone's eyes here by talking about laissez-faire economics and essentially saying they worship this economic system. That's why they went on to allow a famine to happen, a genocide to happen, but they went to let this happen. That isn't really, just as much as you worship an economic system, there is no one on the planet in good conscience ever going to try and claim that an economic system can have precedence over keeping people alive. And the British countless times, countless countries around the world showed this contempt where they committed negligent genocide by just letting people die, by not feeding them. The example I gave earlier was Bengal. And their health they gave really was minimal. And I would argue that the government was trying to give people a certain element of hope, and then they're dying anyway, and that is properly cruel in my opinion. The example I gave earlier of the grain imports that were nowhere near enough to feed anyone.
Right. We'll now take any abstaining points on the motions as long as it's directed to neither side or to both equally. Is this an abstaining point, Chris? Is it?
I'm ready for the proposition.
Mr. Hall.
Amendment. So on this side, you just mentioned the Bengal famine. With them, there was clear contempt for the Indian people.
We were talking
But you haven't sort of put a case forward that there was that contempt for the Irish at the time, or at least in your speeches that hasn't been clear. So, like, is there evidence of that contempt for Irish people, as there were in those famines? And now for the other side, in the case of other famines that have been caused by imperial powers, that famine has been used as a tool of control. It has been used as a tool of genocide in other situations. So I sort of got from the first speaker that famine was not the same as genocide. So like, why does it not count as a genocide if there were deliberate?
Okay, so
yeah.
The proposition response first.
Okay, I'm trying to sort of accept the question. It was quite a large question. You were saying about contempt towards the Indians and the Irish. We haven't demonstrated there's the same contempt towards the Irish. I don't maybe need to do this off just a wee bit. Chris, during some of the speeches, but Connor actually took exact quotes from Lord Palmerston, which I will read out again. We look forward to the day when a Celt will be as rare in the banks of the Shannon as a red man in the banks of the Hudson. And the Irish were very much seen as, okay, they're technically part of this active union thing, but they're not really the same as us at that time. I think actually it was during the Easter Rising debate, so I wish I had the photos now. It was actually from the 1840s. Punch magazine cartoon showing the Irish as monkeys, very simian-like in their attitudes. I think it's safe to say that the Irish were viewed as inferior, and the entire attitude of I also wish that will happen was definitely proceeding in British attitudes at that time. Consistent in British attitudes at that time.
And the opposition to respond to the second part of this question.
Can I just get a refresher? What was your target?
3 points of clarification. Remember this one. I believe it was, why is this not a genocide?
It's used as a tool. It has been used as a tool for genocide, so why is this different?
Yeah, famine has been used as a tool, like, can famine be a genocide, why is this not?
Yeah, I think what separates the case of Ireland and the Great Famine from most genocides is, in most genocides you have a situation where people, whenever they're fleeing from the genocide, they will flee to wherever they can find safe haven. We see this across the world today. But in the case of the Great Famine, about half of the people fleeing the Great Famine went to Great Britain. There was no, and they were welcome. They experienced xenophobia, sure, but 14 million people in Great Britain are descended from Irish people, and they are extraordinarily well integrated into the population, almost invisible.
So also in the 1980s.
Yeah, well, that's the point if I continue. So
also, the 100 years before.
If you look at how, to any particular set of Irish immigrants to Great Britain, the discrimination only lasted for them, that for one generation. It didn't occur to their children, is what I'm trying to say.
Right. And we'll look back around for another round of questions. This is back to the proposition. I'll ask that all questions and answers be kept as brief as possible. And I'll go to Mr. I forget your last name.
I'm doing it, fine. Alright, so in order for me to believe what you're saying is true, right, you're going to need to give me some sort of level of power to the genocide, right? Because genocide is essentially ethically the complete denial of groups' rights, right? The denial of all the rights and the right to live high and for all, right? You look at people of Ireland during this time, they could vote, they could own front, they could own land, they could leave. Jews couldn't do that, people in Holodomor couldn't do that. So how can I possibly draw parity to these genocide and the famine? And somehow say that this was a genocide when other genocides did not have this innate characteristic.
In terms of the rights of Irish, as I said in my speech, the penal laws had been enacted. So they couldn't vote. It was no one man would vote, it was rather as much land you had was the vote you could have. So their rights were inherently right. In terms of they could leave, yes they could leave, but they left in coffin ships that most of them couldn't afford. In terms of comparison with other genocides, I'm sure the most notorious one unfortunately is of course the Holocaust. I made reference in my conclusion there in that there was a culture of death clearly fostered in certain concentration camps which created the sort of effects that resulted in death, and this was indeed a genocide. And as I maintained in my speech, that the entire island of Ireland for the native Irish was created into this culture of death that allowed them to suffer and unfortunately die. So that's how we draw comparisons, and that is a comparison that we do draw. And it's in terms of genocide, it's a very difficult thing to define. It's a very recent definition in terms of history and scholarship, which is why expansion of the definition is useful in this regard, and it's why we can draw comparisons from the past in terms of Poland and Ukraine as well. Thank you.
Opposition respond.
What the proposition member has just said is completely incorrect. The penal laws were repealed in 1829. Catholics were given full rights in that bill. And like I said in my speech, I don't think you're listening, the British government had supported full Catholic emancipation from 1801, and it was the opposition of the British kings that prevented it becoming a reality.
Yeah, something you want to say, you sure can. So, we'll go to any questions for the opposition. Mr. Heron.
This one's kind of more directed towards Boston Football. If I understand correctly, it was that the famine was caused by laissez-faire economic policy. But like many other genocides, are not caused by ideology, and just comparing laissez-faire policy to a religion could not be compared to the ideology that caused the famine and the ideology that the British chose to cause the famine.
I apologise if I gave off the impression that I was saying it was the directing only cause. I mean, perhaps more that it was what allowed it to be perpetuated so readily. In this regard, no, I do not think that it is the reason the famine, because the reason the famine occurred was, as we established from the very beginning, the potato crop failing, the act of God, functionally in insurance terminology. And we can go no further than that as the cause of the genocide. There needs to be this direct intent to qualify as genocide, and we do not believe that exists, and we do not believe it's qualified as genocide.
Proposition to respond.
Okay, Okay, yes, I'm going to largely back you up on the point you made. I think you're 99% right. However, I want to also give a bit of a boost to Russell here. Yes, I agree. I don't think laissez-faire was the only cause of the famine. I think a complete lack of regard towards the Irish was the cause of the famine from the British. I think a policy which was deliberately going around of not helping them whenever they clearly needed help also a cause of the famine. And I think utterly contemptible views of our powers of the colonial expansionism of that time led to countless suffering and death. So yes, I agree with your point largely. I think there's also other factors that need to be considered.
I'll move on now to any abstaining points in the room. Mr. Perrin.
I just want to raise one point in relation to Catholic emancipation. Like, I don't think, certainly not in 1801, where the British government failed for Catholic emancipation. I think it wasn't for the efforts of Daniel O'Connell, who was often ridiculed, very much so, by members of the British government and the House of Commons. He campaigned so vehemently for Catholic emancipation. And it wasn't until, I think, 1829 that the process of emancipation began, and it wasn't fulfilled for, say, 10 years after that to an extent. So there certainly was no, Catholic emancipation was not greeted with open arms by the British government. It was actually ridiculed, and if you look at the records, Daniel O'Connell was certainly not treated warmly by members of the government.
Opposition to response.
I just think that Daniel O'Connell was disrespected by very much of a respected member of Parliament. In fact, Charles Dickens, who was a parliamentary reporter at the time, looked for negotiations that the Commons did this very much to bring him to tears. As an individual, he was very much afforded the respect that he deserved. And largely, the hyper-animosity was on an individual basis. The Irish at large were disregarded and dismissed. In fact, there's an article in the Irish Times, I don't know, a few months ago, about when Oscar Wilde first started making a name for himself in London. He was originally referred to as Mr. Wilde of Borneo. And when everybody was drawn, he was always drawn with certain features like, thick lips and a big nose, accentuated to make him look a little bit more, like a black person.
I'd ask you to bring this back around to relevance of this rubbish.
The idea of Pax Britannica was obviously that the British are on the whole superior, but being superior does not mean you want to kill everyone else. My cousin this entire cabinet was signed in protest of the King's refusal. The British as empire builders were very much different from, say, for example, the French, who were actively malevolent and violent.
You're once again digressing. I'm going to have to ask you to wrap this up very quickly for us to set down.
There's a lot of points that have been buried.
Does the proposition wish to respond to? You don't have to.
I like Oscar Wilde.
We're going to wrap back around to a final round of questions back to the proposition. I'm going to ask that we all try and keep our questions and answers again as briefly as possible, because I can tell a lot of people still want to say some things. So, questions for the proposition. Mr. Hickman.
2 points for third speak for the proposition. Firstly, what is your perspective on the comments by your first speaker that the genocide was a negligent genocide given the definition you accept? And also the consideration that you spoke about the genocide to be directed against the economically lower class members of Western Ireland, when genocide is definitionally not capable of being committed against a political class. By the UN definition you accept.
I understand. So in response to the first definition of negligence, genocide is negligence, as I pointed out to very earlier in this question, the assumption of duty would apply here. And I'm sure you're very aware of the assumption of duty. That once you assume duty of person or people, you must care for them as if you carried out the act. And second, in regards to the second point about political classes cannot be defined as genocide. I would say the political class, in terms of the west of Ireland, it extended to a defined people in native Irish, be them mostly Catholic and mostly Gaelic speaking as well. So in terms of, it was simply on a political class, If you want to go on religious grounds, it was Catholics. If you want to go on other grounds, it would have been those people living west of the Shannon, unfortunately. And if you look at the statistics, you draw a line up from Limerick to Derry, it was those on the left of that line who lost their lives and their lives were totally against them.
Anyone from the opposition?
The point of how West of Ireland was particularly badly affected by the famine, I just want to bring up Donegal, which is as far as west as you can get in Ireland. It's one of the countries which was least affected by the famine because if you look at the map of Donegal, it is mostly off coast, and the main economy there was fishing, and so there is another source of food there, and it's along with the rest of Ulster where there's Antrim, which had Belfast, and Down, which had Armagh, which had Uri, where other industries apart from agriculture prevailed. People largely managed to survive, whereas those were affected particularly badly. That's just something I just wanted to I have a last
Right. Any questions now for the opposition? Mr. Murphy.
I'm going to make an argument against the legal definition of genocide based on some common law principles. It's kind of a contradiction in terms, but I think the common law can establish some really interesting moral principles, and I'm going to stretch back long into the days of my criminal law in first year, which is longer ago than I care to admit. But there's a concept in the common law of England and Wales of what is called oblique intention. And what has been discussed and a lot tonight is the concept of, well, you only intend something when you willingly, when you willingly commit an action of killing someone. That is intention. That is the textbook definition of intention. Oblique intention encapsulates the concept of a set of circumstances that are seen as virtually certain is an intended consequence of your actions. So I think Mr. Nairn talked about the fact of, that we're talking about socio-economic circumstances happening. Some people are winners, some people are losers. It not being a game of Monopoly, you're not just losing a game, a board game, you're losing your means of subsistence, you're losing your life. I think you've tried very hard to pin this definition in a very technical kind of legal way of saying, well, we didn't intend it in the traditional sense, but it was a consequence of our actions that was almost virtually certain to occur. And in my book, at least on a moral level, that is an intended consequence. I don't think they've adequately addressed the fact that a mission in a large sense in those terms can be at the very least a morally culpable intention. And I think you failed to address that argument tonight. I think insofar as it was virtually certain to occur, there were losers in this laissez-faire model. You are at least in some way morally culpable, if not legally culpable.
The opposition to respond?
We don't for a second suggest that it is morally abhorrent what occurred and morally abhorrent what was allowed to happen. What we simply say is this does not qualify as genocide under the particular definition we've been operating under this debate for the entirety of, that UN definition. Ultimately, we don't. Yes, we agree with you that it's a bad thing. We agree with you that it is utterly morally unacceptable. But it's not genocide, and it doesn't fall under our definition as genocide, and we reject the definition which defines it as genocide.
Is the proposition which responds to that at all?
That's a great point. In terms, Russell we're using the United Nations term of genocide. It is an incredibly oblique definition. Genocide is something that is very rarely stated or defined in clear definition. If you look up the paper that the Bible looking up, there's a number of substantive factors to look at that. And in terms of oblique intention, I'm sure it's very, very clear that the list of factors there are indeed themselves oblique. The intent is there, the oblique, the by assumption of duty, the intent is clearly there, genocide.
Right. We'll now move to one final abstaining point to close this out, unless one doesn't exist. Flip. Mr. Kieran.
come up much in this space is the fact that famine was an endemic problem in Ireland up to this point. Naturally, nowhere near on this level. However, it had occurred several times in the 1810s, and I believe a couple of times afterwards in the 1820s and 1830s. So, bearing this in mind, can we justifiably say that the famine was not something foreseen on either side? And I think that does affect how both arguments are constructed.
Proposition to respond first this time.
Oh, we respond first, right? Yeah, okay, got some. Right. So, yes, obviously famine was an endemic problem in Ireland in the 1810s due to the famines that I very recently discovered had already occurred. However, famine was also a problem across the rest of the globe at this time. And I think what you have is this famine's actually been titled the Great Famine due to the sheer magnitude and loss of life. And I addressed this earlier in my speech, that if this had been a few thousand people, or if this had even been 10,000 people, I could have very readily, I believe, this was a case of mismanagement and laissez-faire. However,
were just dummy runs then, were they?
Roger, please.
However, in the case of this one, you're talking about a magnitude and the loss of life reaching into the million plus zone. And I think whenever that happens, you have to take into consideration that there should have been some sort of governmental action, and there was a lack of inaction and a lack of care, which led to a through negligence genocide occurring.
And then opposition to respond.
So I'd firstly like to comment that, as I said in my speech, the potato had only recently become the most dominant crop. Before many Irish families, like you mentioned, they were failures of grain harvest because of bad weather. But the potato is more reliable than grain. It can grow in harsher terrain. It doesn't require the same weather. It requires a quarter of the land that grain does to produce the same amount of food. But as I argued in my speech, the blight of 1845, 46 and 47 was unprecedented. And you need to remember that the famine only got worse after the blight had ended because the policy of the government changed whenever Lord Russell came into power and implemented the more classical liberal solution to the famine, which he thought would work.
And with that, we wrap up the debate for this evening and move on to the final vote. So, this is the members-only binding vote, so get your membership cards out. If you don't have one on you and you are a paid-up member, I'll know, so you can still stick your hand up anyway. But if you're not a paid-up member, I will know as well, so your vote will not be counted. Right, so, the motion is this House believes the famine was the genocide. This is our vote on speakerability. It's not on which side you more personally affiliate with, but which side you believe spoke better. So, if you would like to vote for the proposition, please raise your hand and say aye.
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 Good job.
28. Right. And if you wish to vote in favour of the opposition, please raise your hands and say nay. Nay. And if you would choose to vote abstaining, please raise your hands and say nay. Well, I now hand you back over for one last time to our monarch of meritocracy, Mr. Matthew Bradley. Will you please read us back that vote?
I'm going to do so with energy. Do you want to hear the vote?
No!
Yes! Way to destroy my confidence, Morgan. Do you want to hear the vote?
Yes!
Okay. There are 28 ayes, 3 nays, and 2 abstentions.
Then the ayes have it. The ayes have it. Motion passes. Before we all all start leaving, I'll remind you just of a couple more things. Michelle, as always, we're going back to Lavery's bar. If you didn't get to address your questions then, or you have anything else you want to discuss in the debate or otherwise, there is the place to do it. And as always, if you want to speak at any of our debates, you can find on the return card, please talk to Mr. Matthew Bryson, who's over there, because we're always looking for people to speak at things. Am I missing something? Are you giving me a look, or?
I'm not sure I can sign up this week because we do the money box.
Yeah, well, if you want to sign up and become a paid-up member, then arrive next week when we are debating a motion.
It's this house regrets the gig economy, I believe. It is.
Next week is this house regrets the gig economy. Your Ubers, your Airbnbs, your such and suches, were they a good idea? Arrive next week for that. And therefore it is that I do